Hi everyone, and welcome to our Lunch and Learn for October. This is part 3 of our Making Sense of the Senses series. So if you missed the first two, that's fine. They're available as well to catch up. So whilst I'm trying to make it so you don't necessarily need to have listened to this too, if this is, particularly something of interest, it probably is beneficial just to get a background. But if you understand the sensory system well, or you're just interested in this, have a listen. You can always go back and refresh stuff. Okie dokie. So we'll kick off. I'm just making sure that everything is good to go on my end. We had a few technical difficulties, but that's okay. So the kind of tagline for this one is regulation to resilience. And resilience wrong, that's wonderful. The reason we kind of did this is because when we started doing the sensory systems, the first session really was about the theory and the idea of kind of what the senses are, very much that base level knowledge. And that was so it was accessible to everyone. And then last time we kind of moved from what is sensory processing to then what is sensory modulation. So a little tiny bit of a recap is basically sensory processing is how we take in and understand, our body interprets that, kind of what are our senses. And sensory modulation is once our body has that information from our sensory system, what does it do with it? How does it react? And we talked a little bit about how different bodies have different reactions. So again, without going into too much detail, what we tend to see is that we have people who might be hypersensitive and might react really strongly to different sensations. They might have, their bodies might have a really big sensitive reaction. And then on the other end, we have those who are hyposensitive. So those ones, they need a lot of that sensory input to kind of react to it. And we sort of talked a little bit about what that kind of might look like in practice. So the analogy, which I'll continue to use because I find it useful for my brain and useful for other people's brains, hopefully, is that when we talk about kind of our sensory threshold, I often talk about it being a cup. So if you're hypersensitive, if you're very, very sensitive to sensory input, it's like you have a little tiny cup. And so that sensory input comes in and it makes your cup overflow. If you're on the other end and you need a lot of sensory input to kind of notice or, be able to engage, that means you have a really big cup. And so the sensory input comes in and it doesn't fill. You're not kind of in that space where you can, we talk about in occupational therapy, you can't engage in your occupations because your body isn't in that just right state. So I'll probably continue to use that analogy a little bit today. But what we kind of found from talking in the first one about the theory is really that people kind of wanted to know a little bit more, particularly what people were asking for was sensory and attachment. So I will be going through that today. But also I thought it would be a good time to talk about more about sensory and mental health, sort of looking a little bit deeper in that, particularly for sensory modulation and trauma populations. I think it's really important if we are practicing in a neurodiverse affirming way and a trauma informed way that we understand not only that people have different sensory preferences, but also that these populations can have really kind of, I guess, different and big reactions. And so then how do we use that in practice, whether that be in the therapy room or whether that be kind of in our classroom or workplace? How can we make the environments for these kind of populations more accessible and thinking about that kind of stuff? I have also included just a little tiny bit on interoception. I think I mentioned this in the last episode, but interoception almost can be its own presentation for an hour, and certainly it deserves that. So this is just a really, really tiny one to touch on, just to kind of get some ideas around how interoception can affect our sensory modulation, how we respond to sensations. And lastly, just a little bit on, I guess, how we can support sensory needs and kind of thinking about, okay, we've got all these different reactions, all these different people with different needs. How can we think about how to kind of manage that? So a little tiny bit of information from each. And the idea, though, as well, is if there's something that you really want to know, hopefully this can pique your interest to go and investigate that more. There's lots of lovely resources available. So I really encourage you, if you find something that really interests you today, we won't be going into a great amount of detail, follow up, look into it. I've, of course, got our details at the end of the presentation, please feel to reach out to us if you've got specifics or a specific question or want to know where to find things. We're more than happy to engage with you and answer those questions. So, one of the reasons that we're so passionate about sensory modulation and sensory processing here, and it's linked to mental health, is this idea, of course, is that, you know, everybody's body has different needs and people will seek what they need, and that will either be adaptively or maladaptively. And so when we talk about sensory modulation and mental health, there is obviously our bodies telling us what's going on and what sort of is going on inside of us. And our bodies and our brain will try and regulate. And if we have strategies available to us to be able to respond in an adaptive way, we will do so. But of course, if our brain is just unable to access that kind of that cognitive and that thinking, those thinking strategies in the moment, or if we're looking at young kids who might be triggered or just haven't learnt those strategies, our bodies will seek what they need, and that can look maladaptive. So one of the things I haven't dived into too much, but I might mention today, is really sometimes people are like, oh, is it sensory or is it behavior? And I think the big takeaway whenever I'm talking about behavior is that behavior always comes from a need. You know, kids, there's that lovely Ross Green quote, kids do well when they can, you know, so I think if we are seeing big reactions, particularly when we know they're sensory, I think it's that idea that there is a sensory need and we need to help young people or whoever have the strategies so they can respond adaptively. They can have their body and their mental health needs met in a way that sort of works for everyone. Okay. And so I've kind of touched on this. The reason that we like to think about this is because, and I talked about this in the last episode, there is that huge brain and body connection. So we often sort of look at young people or look at these kids who are having a big reaction and we kind of think, oh my goodness, you know, what's going on for them, or we can't necessarily think about it in our own experiences. But I often explain to people, when the sensory input in the environment isn't matching your needs, you will also feel irritated. You know, we understand that our bodies do affect kind of our thinking and our mood and how we respond to that. So often I give the example that let's say you're at work and you're trying to get something done and it's taking a lot of thinking power, you're really trying to focus on it. So imagine if you're trying to do that and concentrate and there is a jackhammer outside. And I'm sure we've all had some sort of experience where we're trying to do something and there's something noisy or there's just chaos going on. Our ability to concentrate and also remain calm in that very stressful moment is very much impacted by the sensory environment. And so it becomes very hard for us to think about, you know, staying calm and sort of being able to engage. Now, if we are, you know, adults who are working hopefully very well in the world and we have strategies, we might employ some of them. So we might either move to a different space to finish our work. If it's at our house or our office, we might completely move to like the coffee shop or somewhere else. If we can, we might put earmuffs. We might do all these different strategies because we understand that our body is telling us that things aren't working. And so our brain can come online and be like, okay, this sensory environment isn't working. It's not working for what I need to do. Let's manage that with sensory processing. So I'm going to talk a little bit more then, I guess, about that sort of how we understand that our bodies can send us cues and our brains can kind of come and think or be affected by that. So this is really important, and we're going to talk about this when it comes to trauma, because what we have is that these experiences in our body and what our body often tells us, it can be so loud and such a huge response for people that it actually, it overrides the brain or it makes it really difficult. So I'm going to go into that a little bit more, but I think most people sort of can understand a lot more these days about that brain-body connection. And most common, the reference people know is that body keeps score, that sort of that idea that what happens to us in our body, what our nervous system has learnt, sometimes overrides our brain. So very much there's that huge processing between sensory processing and mental health. And that's why we look at how we can use sensory modulation, so how we modify the environment or the strategies we have for ourselves, how that can help us manage those. So we talked a little bit about trauma there. So, in the green part there, trauma can shape sensory responses. Some people might be hyper or hypo alert. I'll talk to that a little bit more. But we know as well with the neurodiverse community that they have lots of difference in sensory processing. So in autism and ADHD, we often see as part of that diagnostic profile that there are quite a few sensory differences. And like I mentioned in the previous presentations as well, those can look vastly different. So even if we're thinking about that cup being really tiny or really big, even between different senses in one person, someone can be hyper and hypo. So it is this really complex kind of interplay, even with people, that there are different times and different senses when they'll have different needs. But what we know really commonly is that in our neurodiverse population, they do have quite significant sensory differences, and that can be either end of the spectrum. Again, quite similar to trauma, anxiety can often amplify these sensory sensitivities. And again, you might know that from your own experience. So anxiety and stress, we can kind of put together sometimes as feelings in the body. You might just feel a bit more irritable and prickly. So if you're feeling anxious or worried, and again, sound is often a sensory input we can't control if we're in different environments. If you're already feeling anxious and there's lots of noise around you, you will feel not only more sensitive to that sound, but you might also react to it a little bit more strongly. And again, that's because your body is giving you this message that things are chaotic and it's not feeling well. And so it's harder to access those kind of thinking strategies. So when sensory needs aren't met, we often get labeled, we see those labels as challenging behaviors, but really it's an that's a bit hard to say. It's an unmet regulation need. So I guess it's one of those things that I want people to take away say is that if we are seeing that challenging behavior, if someone's getting labeled as challenging behavior, what we really need to think about is what's going on. And a lot of the time, if it's a sensory need, we need to meet that first. And I think a really lovely example of this as well is, we understand from a very early age with babies and toddlers that sensory needs and the body's cues around sensory needs make a lot of sense with how someone's feeling. So if babies are sleepy or hungry or thirsty, we know that they tend to be irritable. They get upset. They have these huge responses. That's an input from inside. That's a sensory need. If things are too loud and they can't sleep, they're just picky. So really, we would never label, a baby who's kind of reacting to the environment as challenging. We know that they've just got a need and they're not old enough to have those strategies. And that's when we as adults come in and help them. So we don't expect people, or especially young people, who haven't got the skills to be able to regulate that. And so what we know is that when people have different experiences in their life, they might still be learning that. And I guess what I'd really encourage is for people to extend empathy to, young people who are still working through those strategies and how to regulate. So a little bit more on that. I've kind of discussed this very much with that hyper and hypo arousal, but so this looks a lot, and I won't go again. You've got things like polyvagal theory, which is very interesting in its own right. I won't even touch today, but what we kind of understand and what we can take away is that during the day, we want to sit in this optimal state of arousal. And we often talk about that being a window of tolerance. So, for example, if you're under responsive, you're too low, you kind of haven't got enough of that sensory input. Sorry, I've just thought about last time I gave the coffee analogy and someone said that was really good. So I'm just going to use the same analogy as I did last time. Right, so if you are low, the one I often say to adults, the way to think about your nervous system is if you're a coffee drinker and you get up in the morning and you haven't had your coffee and you're tired and sluggish, that's like being under responsive. You're sitting in there. You have your cup of coffee and you might be in that perfect optimal state. If you have too much caffeine, you'll be jittery, you'll be in that high over responsive. Your nervous system will feel scattered, everything will feel big and loud. So that's too high. So that optimal state of arousal we want is our window of tolerance. So that's where we sit in our nice kind of, where we often talk to kids about it being a calm alert. They feel calm enough to engage in learning, but they're also alert enough to kind of take that in and take the information in that they need for the day. So same with adults, you'll know that feeling. You're feeling good, you're feeling happy, but you're still kind of around. It's not like you're too relaxed and you're not able to do anything. So in healthy development, so particularly when we're looking at trauma as well, I'll talk about the window of tolerance there. When we're looking at having healthy development and a good sensory system that is looked after, we have a nice range of window of tolerance. So we can kind of deal with a bit of up and down in sensory inputs or things that are going on in our day, and we stay within that window of tolerance. Now, if we have things, for example, trauma that happen in our lives, that window of tolerance gets shrunk right down. So all of a sudden, you kind of got this good, nice range where you can tolerate quite a little bit going on in your day to a very small window of tolerance. And so that means that all of a sudden, two people experiencing the same day and the same kind of things happening can have very different experiences. And so as well, a lot of the work we're doing, particularly when we're looking at people with trauma, is really helping them to expand the window of tolerance. So that's got quite a few things going on. So first of all, we have to help them understand their own body and what's happening in it. They can understand where their window of tolerance is. And then once we have them understand that window of tolerance, particularly in young kids, we give them experiences which help expand that window of tolerance. So that's when we're really looking at coming in and doing that sensory regulation. So again, that could be a whole other talk in itself. Certainly, I would encourage people, if you're interested in kind of particularly sensory modulation and the window of tolerance, Tina Champagne, fantastic stuff. She is so incredible. I would really encourage you to look into Tina Champagne's work. This is also, Tina Champagne really is the champion of looking at reduction of seclusion and restraint, particularly in acute mental health wards. So Tina's work really has been key in reducing kind of seclusion and restraint, and she's done that through sensory modulation. So when you're thinking about people having acute mental health episodes, how they must be feeling in their body, how they must really have a lot going on for them, what we found is that sensory regulation is really a wonderful tool to help people calm down and help them manage what is a really difficult time, and a nervous system that could be quite reactive, and having a much more positive experience. So I've spoken about this a little bit already, but I'll just expand on that trauma and sensory sensitivities. So like we were just talking about with the window of tolerance, often have a really small window of tolerance. So when we're thinking about having a small window of tolerance, you have to think about that as one aspect of how trauma can affect the sensory system. But you also have to think in that they can often have heightened sensitivity. So after trauma, the nervous system can become on alert, making sight, sound, touch, and smell feel more intense and overwhelming. So it's this double whammy of small window of tolerance through our developmental experiences in life, but also a really reactive nervous system. So what that kind of can mean when you're looking at trauma, and when we kind of think about how the body reacts, and, you know, when we're talking about that body keep score, basically our brains are wired for survival. So when we're thinking again about trauma, particularly when we're talking about trauma from an early childhood, we know that the brain will always prioritize survival. So for the brain and the body, what's happening is that a young person is brought into an environment which is really maladaptive, there's lots going on, and the body thinks this is a really horrible place for me to keep safe. I need to prioritize survival. And when we think about survival and keeping ourselves safe, automatically we think about being really heightened. You know, if you are in an environment that makes you feel unsafe, all of your senses go up. You're really sensitive to movement and noise, and your body is very much on edge. And that is what we see in the trauma population. Now, you can also imagine having that heightened sensitivity, what that does long term as well. So it makes sense that often we have this kind of cyclical problem of people are in this constant state of arousal, and therefore they're feeling really upset and reactive, and then they're more sensitive to the environment, and then they react more, and it just can kind of go on and on. So again, they have that small window of tolerance, but they're also really heightened. What we can see, though, I guess, is the flip side of that. So we can see that people with trauma have these really heightened sensory experiences. But then on the flip side, what can happen is that the body can shut down. And so some people can then experience this huge range of reduced sensory awareness. And quite often we can see this inconsistent. So the person can often swing from being hypersensitive to not noticing things. So again, if we're thinking about survival, we might be hypersensitive to sound, but we might not be as sensitive to things like hunger. And again, I'll talk a little bit in interoception. Often people with a traumatic background can have poor interoception. So the sensations from their body that they might be receiving, they don't really notice. They're not prioritizing that because their body is prioritizing survival and kind of keeping into what's going on in the external environment. And again, I do recognize that this is a lot of information very quickly. And again, we can go into more of these in detail in other presentations. But I guess in a very quick summary, what I'd also say is that when we're thinking about trauma and we're thinking about people's bodies being in fight, flight, or freeze, when we're talking about fight or flight, we're very much, yes, hypersensitive. We're in those experiences where everything feels really heightened. But then we also have freeze. And on top of that, we have this numbing shutdown. So people might be heard the word the fawn phase. So we now talk about fight, flight, freeze kind of being up here. But then if trauma continues or if we continue to be in that stressful environment, we can flick down to a fawn state. So again, whole other presentation there. I'd certainly encourage you, if you haven't heard about the fawn state, to look into that. But just thinking about that fawn state from a sensory perspective, that is when someone is shut down. So that's when we might talk about someone being dissociative and completely kind of, like you can see the person is responding and they're awake, but it kind of seems like they might be a bit vacant or kind of checked out. And that is, again, the body's survival mechanism. They can't, the body's saying, okay, we can't get out of this situation, so we're going to shut down and protect ourselves. And so again, thinking about that from a sensory perspective, these are the people who might seem like really hyposensitive. So their bodies might just kind of be getting the sensory information and not filtering it or not responding to it. It's very much that dissociative state. So I've got a little bit more on this as we go, but I've already talked mostly about why this happens. So basically what happens is that the trauma changes the way that the brain receives and interprets sensory input. And I won't go into too much of the neurobiology of it, which is really hard for me because I love the brain. I love talking about the brain. But basically, what can happen is, the brain is on high alert, looking at that fight, flight, freeze. It's really overreactive, looking for danger because it knows and it has learned that it needs to do that to survive. What we can then have is that these senses, through development as well, our bodies are trying to prioritize survival. So when it gets a sensory input, the body might react because the brain just is so hyper aware that it has trouble putting those sensations into context. So this is when we're looking at trauma and we're saying that it might be a trigger and the body might react and the brain kind of hasn't got that brain-body connection. So a really, again, kind of common example people might understand is that when we look at like veterans or those people who might have PTSD, so they've come back, their bodies have been in this huge survival state where they've had to survive and they've had to have their nervous system really on edge for a long time because obviously there's lots of conflict and they need to keep safe. So it might be that they're very sensitive to loud sounds. They might hear a car backfire and it sounds like a gun and they will completely react. So their brain is wired to keep them safe. And so even though they might be kind of going about their everyday life, it is so sensitive that it will react and put them in that trigger and that flashback. And that kind of can be the case for the trauma population. So our bodies react. So again, it's that the body keeps score. The bodies react without the brain necessarily having a think and being able to process what's going on. The other thing I guess I'll just say about the trauma population when we're thinking about sensory, and again, this is not doing this whole concept justice, but very much what we see is that when trauma occurs at a really young age, we don't necessarily have in our brains, we don't have developed kind of this idea of explicit and implicit memories. So just really briefly, explicit is when we can kind of pull up, oh gosh, I hope I've got this right. I'm like going through my brain now. When we can pull up a memory. So I say, oh, remember this, and you can pull it up in your brain. Implicit memories are, this is very much again like that body kind of remembers when the brain does it. So when we're really little and before we have the ability to create explicit memories that we can pull up, we have implicit memories. So our brain kind of stores these experiences for later, but we haven't developed the part of the brain that can pull that up. And that's, you know, kind of makes sense. You don't remember a lot from when you're a baby. Sometimes people do have really good photographic memories, but for the most part, particularly when we're really little, we haven't developed that. So we don't have those memories of when we were really, really little. Why this is important when we're thinking about our sensory system is that our bodies and, you know, for young people in traumatic experiences, they haven't got the explicit memory of why something might be triggering in their body. So they've had these really awful experiences and the body's kind of gone, this is something that I need to keep on. We need to keep safe. This is something that's going wrong and I need to remember this. And so it creates an implicit memory and the body can't remember why this is triggering them, or it might not even understand that it's triggering them. And basically it responds to things. So what we see often in the trauma population, particularly when we're talking about those really young kids experiencing this, is there will be reactions and they might not necessarily know why. And it can be really difficult because people can be reacting to things that have happened to them, but they might not have the explicit memories to put that into words. This can happen a lot with smells as well. Smell is a really important sense. I think I touched on it very, very briefly in the previous presentation. And again, as much as I love neurobiology, I'm very conscious I'm going to butcher this explanation, but without quoting me, our sense of smell is, it basically has a direct path. All our other kind of senses have a bit of, you know, other parts of the brain that they go through first, but our sense of smell is the one that develops first. So it, you know, we can smell our mum and we kind of, you know, from a survival point of view, if we can't see or hear anything else, if we smell, we know if something's safe, like the food example. You know, again, we're thinking about our brains keeping us safe. If we can't see the food or kind of tell what it looks like, if we sniff it and we can tell it's off, from a survival point of view, our brain is like, no, don't eat that, keep yourself safe. So it's a really important one because, again, thinking about babies, they can't quite see, they've got all this other stuff, but their sense of smell is developed. And the thing about that is then because it is so developed from such an early age, is that, and it doesn't go through the other parts of the brain, is that it has basically a highway to just reaction. So again, if you're thinking about not having those explicit memories, so this is why we can really react quite quickly to senses of smell. And it can pull up memories for us. So for example, if you smell like sometimes like the very classic like Sunday roast, which I don't think people do much anymore, but you know, if you smell a cake or a cookie, something really warm that you have lovely memories of, it brings that up. And it doesn't matter what it is. If you've got that kind of pleasant memory with it, if you smell it, it'll automatically trigger. And often you'll be like, oh, that feels good. And then it'll pull up the memory. So again, this is really important because if there are smells that are triggering people, there can be reactions and they might not know why that's going on because it's such an automatic one. So I think it's really important when we're looking at the different senses and how to be trauma informed. We think about all of them, and sometimes smell doesn't get the kind of the sense of, or it doesn't get the justice that it deserves. So again, this is kind of, I'm going to talk about the therapeutic approaches, but when I say the therapeutic approaches, this is trauma informed, but I think this is also good practice, just, you know, for anywhere. It doesn't matter where you are. I think everyone can use a little bit of sensory modulation tools. So when we're thinking about our therapeutic approaches to being more trauma informed, what we want to do is create predictable, low stimulation environments where the person feels safe and in control. So again, without going into the whole trauma theory, which is a presentation on its own, what we want when we're making people safe is the feeling of predictability and that they are in control. So that's why we have a little sign here, and this also obviously extends to the neurodiverse population, is that when they come in, they have control as much as possible of the sensory environment. So we let people turn off the lights or use lamps if they want to. We can have music, we can turn it off, we can change different rooms, we can change the lighting in different rooms. The idea is that we're creating this safe space for them, and it's always the same, it's predictable, and they have the control of that sensory experiences. And so they are able to listen to their body, and that's therapeutic because they're learning to do that, but also they're able to create a therapeutic environment. They know what's happening. It kind of helps with that predictability. It kind of helps, I guess, make them not so on edge, make them more receptive to being in a therapeutic space. So that's something that's really important, is that predictability and control, and sort of coming at it with a low stimulation kind of environment, because it's very easy to kind of add stimulation back in. So if we kind of start off with a nice, quiet, dark space, we can then add sound and we can add light, and it's very easy to go up. But if someone comes in and they're overstimulated, you've kind of got to work to bring them down, which is quite difficult. Whereas if you come in and you see people need a little bit more regulation, like sometimes kids do, we can kind of add things to regulate them really quickly. And you know, getting the body up is easier than calming us down. So that's kind of what we want. And as well, again, this is both relevant for trauma-informed and neurodiverse affirming practice. Having sensory modulation tools available is, you know, a very basic thing that you can do to help people feel more safe and secure in the space. So sometimes that's different options around, okay, I'm just gonna this in. So sometimes that's different kind of tools that we might have around, like whether it be weighted blankets or cushions, weighted materials. You know, when we're looking at that trauma population, things that are very kind of nice, like swaying, rocking, drumming can be therapeutic, and don't have the knowledge to do that, so I won't go there. You know, again, it's that calming input, that soft light. So as well, when we're thinking about helping people with their mental health needs, what can be really useful is our grounding strategies. And this is kind of good because, again, if you're thinking about whether you are hypo or hyper alert, grounding can kind of move us into that just right state. So if we're really sensitive and we kind of need to be brought down, some of our grounding activities can really help us kind of calm. But if we're feeling like we're just a little bit out of sorts in our body, if you've kind of got people in that dissociative state, kind of doing something where they're getting feedback from their body can help bring them from a hypo into a just right state as well. Well, it's telling me I've got 5 minutes left, but I'm just going to ignore that and keep going. So again, if there was sort of one thing that I would sort of say, yep, take this away, it's definitely when you're working with people and different sensory needs, that choice and control is important. And again, where you can offer sensory tools, I think one of the best things and the easiest things that we've done is put fidgets in every room, and we have a variety of fidgets. And I think that just helps a lot of people when they're feeling a bit nervous, and that, you know, if you're thinking about going into a therapeutic setting, that can make you a little bit more nervous. So having something they can play with is a really good way of helping people regulate. And again, it could be fidgeting because they're anxious and that's something to do with their hands, helping them kind of down regulate. Or it might be that they're kind of tired and kids are coming in from school and they need something to fidget with that'll sort of help them upregulate. So they're in that calm alert space, they're in that nice window of tolerance so they can engage in therapy. you might be able to see if you are watching the video. Oh, it's all fuzzy. I was going to say we've got our sensory room behind me. I should do like a little tour after, but we've also got our swing set. I'll try and get the camera to be less fuzzy at the end so I can sort of show you our space, because our space is purposely designed to help young people regulate. That is the most important thing. And again, if you're thinking about that brain-body connection, when people start therapy, it's often that idea of the very classic example we see kind of in movies where it's like, oh yeah, sit down on the couch, talk, and you'll feel better, you'll leave, and that's it. That's great. That's therapy. And it's not like that in reality. You know, first of all, we have to feel regulated in our body. We have to get our bodies feeling calm and safe before we're able to kind of access that part of our brain that lets us talk through those experiences. And so that's why really where we are, it's like, okay, how can we help our young people come in and feel as regulated as they can in their bodies? What does that feel like for them? How can they learn that and learn the strategies to stay in that regulated space? And then once they're there, that's when we can kind of bring on those really thinking strategies. Which leads in really lovely to interoception. So again, this is just a super, super brief overview. If you are particularly interested in interoception and looking more, I suppose, as well, I was going to say from an occupational therapy lens, but I think Kelly Maher is just, I hope I've said her name right, is a really wonderful person to look into. So she is an occupational therapist. I'm going to call her the queen of interoception. I don't know if she'll take that title or not. She's really lovely, but Kelly Maher's stuff on interoception, if you look it up, she's got lots of really good resources and lots of free resources. She's very generous with her time and those kind of things. So I definitely, if you want to know more about interoception, because my one slide will not do it justice, I'd certainly encourage you to read more about that. And I think, again, if you're looking at working with the trauma population, you're a diverse population, or really any kind of mental health stuff, it's really important that you sort of have a look into interoception so you can understand a bit better, and that can help inform your therapies. So interoception is what we call the hidden sense. So we have our 5 external senses that we've talked about. So hearing, seeing, smell, taste, touch. That's our 5 external. We then have the 2 more internal ones that we kind of talk about a little bit more now, which is vestibular, which is kind of our sense of movement, inner ear, balance, spinning, that kind of thing. And proprioception, which is the feedback from our muscles and joints about kind of feedback about how much pressure we've got, things like that. We understand our body sense. There are internal senses, but then there's this one that we now understand is the 8th internal sense, which is interoception. And so basically what it is, it's our internal messages and sensory system in our body. So hunger, thirst, pain, how we're feeling, when do we need to go to the bathroom? How is our breathing going? All that kind of stuff, the messages we get from our organs. And this is really important because often what we see both, if we're looking at trauma in the neurodiverse community, as well as when sort of people are going through different mental health episodes, is that there is a lowered sense of interoception. So it's harder for them to notice those cues. So the other thing that you need to think about with interoception is often when we're thinking about emotions and understanding our emotions, that is coming from the sense in our body. And so when you have a really underdeveloped interoceptive system, it can be really hard for you to notice how you're feeling in your body. And so then what this needs is that basically, it's like a warning light going off in our body system. Let's just think about hunger. So if our body's like, oh yeah, I'm a little bit hungry now, I'll send out the warning signal. It's almost like there's interoception kind of, if there's a poor interoception, it's like there's a fog in front of that. And so it's sending out this little light, it's just blinking, but they might not notice it. And it's not until there's alarms blaring and there's this huge signal, it's flashing lights, that people might be like, oh my gosh, I'm starving, I'm ravenous. And by that point, you're hungry, you're dysregulated. You can see this. So basically, again, it's we know, like as we're developing this sense, look at toddlers when they're hungry. They don't know they're hungry, they're just like cranky, or they need a nap, and it's like they don't know what their bodies are doing, and they're reacting in these huge emotional ways. So we can know and we can think about this system developing from toddlers up to adults. But we need to kind of extend that understanding and empathy to lots of people, including the neurodiverse population who we know develop on a different kind of scale. And you know yourself, I sort of say to people, if you're really busy and you're not tuned into your body, you're getting things done, you're having a crazy day, your focus and your body are elsewhere. For example, if you're stressed and you're getting things done, your sensory system is not tuned into how you're feeling inside. It might be like, I've got this to do. It's occupied elsewhere. And then all of a sudden you get to the end of the day and you're so cranky. You're like, why am I feeling like this? It's because you haven't eaten or drunk, or you're tired. You're not, no one is nice when they're tired. Everyone's cranky, but our body is reacting. And I think we have to remember, when we're not internally checking in and understanding that feeling, it can lead to certain emotional responses. So again, when we don't have a good, when the neurodiverse population, let's say, isn't being able to pick up on those signals, that's when we can have problems. And a really classic example, even, thinking outside of kind of classic mental health, is often neurodiverse kids, young people, have a lot of trouble toilet training. And that can be because you've got this mix of, I can't tell when I need to go to the toilet. They don't get the same signals. So they might not get it till they're busting. And then they're like, oh my God, I need to go really quickly. But also then you've got different sensitivities. So you might have a decreased interoception awareness, but that touch or tactile might feel really uncomfortable. So then they feel hyper aware when they go to the toilet and what that feeling is. So that's really uncomfortable for them. And quite often we do see that. And then we've got all these other interplay of pieces with development. And what we end up seeing is that it's really difficult, really delayed toilet training, and sensory system is a huge piece of that. And again, it's like why we need to think about these things. But yeah, definitely what can happen is it can lead to emotional confusion. It can lead to these really tricky experiences as well, where we don't know what's going on in our body. We might not be reacting to what's going on for us. And the pointy end of that is then we can have these huge emotional reactions. And I guess if people aren't aware of what's going on for them, and then all of a sudden it's this build up, and like in school, kids are reacting and going off. It's like, oh my gosh, that came from nowhere. Not that it came from nowhere. It's just potentially that the sensory environment was not helpful for that young person, and they might not have noticed as those experiences were building up, or they might not have had the words to express it, and then it comes out as an explosion, and people sort of go, oh, they go from 0 to 100. And it might seem like that, but it might be that they and us, as well as the adults around them, have not seen that kind of, 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 100. We only see that explosion at the end. And that's, again, where therapy can come in and sort of help us tune into our body, help us understand those sensory cues, but then expand that window of tolerance through environmental adaptations, teaching strategies, changing the way they engage, all that kind of stuff. I've sort of touched on this a little bit. Oh, sorry. I did this in Canva, and one of the problems with Canva is it doesn't highlight your spelling mistakes. So again, when I was kind of doing this and I was throwing it together, I was going really quickly and I wasn't being very slow and checking my work. So there's a few little spelling errors here and there if you're watching. If you're listening, just pretend that I've done wonderful spelling, and I never do any errors in my presentation, but I do apologize if you're looking at this and wondering why it says relationships. But one thing I will talk as well a little bit, again, whole other presentation itself, is how sensory can impact not only the attachment relationship, but also if we're looking at like couples or different kids. So as we sort of talked about in the first two presentations, is that everyone can have a different sensory profile. Everyone has different sensory needs. Now, this can be wonderful, but when you live with someone else who has the opposite end of your sensory needs, it can cause conflict. So, for example, if someone likes, like a really good example I've had is that there was a kid who his stim was really loud noises. He would kind of screech, and that was how he regulated his system. It was sort of the predictable sound, kind of felt him reset. Now, he had a parent who was really sensitive to sound. And as you can imagine, all of a sudden you've got these two very valid sensory systems living under the one roof and dysregulating each other. Same thing if we see kids who really love like messy play, and they're like, yeah, I want to get messy play. And you've got a parent who's like, I cannot think of anything worse than touching slime. All of a sudden you have this mismatch. And it can be really, really tough, like really tricky to navigate. And I guess really quickly, without going into it, of course, because we don't have time, is that understanding your sensory preferences is the first step. And then kind of understanding, whoever you're living with, their sensory love language, and finding a middle ground. And again, that's sort of where more occupational therapy can come into play here, because it's like, okay, everyone needs their needs met in the household. Everyone has different sensory needs, but we need everyone to be regulated. And so how can we do this? And again, it's the same thing when we're sort of looking at school. You might have two very different sensory profile kids, and you need to meet those. And it's like, how do we meet that? And it's this really interesting kind of interplay about how we work out strategies that kind of can suit everyone. And again, this is really important when we're thinking about sensory and attachment, because how we understand the world and how we respond to others can really come from a lot of our early life experiences. So when we're thinking about how our sensory system is developed, I feel like I should put this a bit more at the start. We've got our own personal, gene expressions, how kind of we were growing up in utero. That can have a really important impact. So, when we're thinking about, babies in utero developing, are they experiencing high levels of stress from their mum? Are they, oh, my computer's frozen, I'm really anxious about that. Are they feeling high, sensory input? Oh, hang on, I'm nervous because it's frozen. And so I'm really worried that I'm chatting away. So if someone can chat, if I froze, oh, there we go. I started again. I'll get to tell me in the chat, surely, if, well, say it's not frozen. I'll just keep and hope. My computer is like angry. Oh dear. It's a big thing. Kind of working. So, oh, that threw me off. But yeah, sensory when we're developing in utero, if you've got a really stressed, mum, if she's not in a good environment, getting that kind of feedback. Our nervous system is getting wired to be really active, lots of loud noises. That's kind of our early development. And then you're thinking about, nature nurture, but also what kind of going through is that making more sensitive? Their body has to react to that. Are they in a situation where so they're not exploring the world, and then they've got underdeveloped kind of sensory experiences? And then, of course, what happens in our day-to-day life and how we respond to that. So we've got all these things which can kind of affect our attachment, but we also have to understand, I guess, how that is in a relationship. I feel like I've went haywire a bit now. My computer's just done. So basically, what that means is that we need to think about supporting everyone's needs. Oh, is it coming up? Yeah. So I guess if we're thinking about that from a framework point of view, it's about understanding awareness. So it's kind of part of what we're doing here, where we're assisting educate people about the sensory system, understanding not only our own, understanding others. From there, we can think about so what can we do to help kind of make it a very calm and inviting place where people can then come in and their own sensory needs. So, we have all those options much when we're thinking about that trauma and neurodiverse affirming practice. I think as well, again, if we're thinking about how people connect first. So it is really important. We need to feel regulated in their bodies before they trust us or do that therapeutic work. Sitting in schools, kids need to feel able to learn. We need them to be regulated in their body before they calm enough. And so understanding and connecting with them and helping them have those experiences can really assist. And then last of all, of course, that's so offering options to regulate. And I think it's also important therapeutic tool. Not only does that teach people understand their body, but also that their choices are really valid and important. And then teaching them strategies. So again, if you're looking at, I guess, your takeaways from this, it's about not only how the three systems work, but then how can you, that's really about, connection and choice so people can participate. So lucky last slide, if it comes up, I still frozen on my screen, so I'm really hoping it's okay. But conclusions and questions. So please feel free to reach out anytime to us. So my email is hannah.bridges@therapies.com. Quite happy to answer questions, or if you have feedback around that, this is the third one in our sensory series, and great if I could tell you what the next one is, but it'll probably be Megan. It's great because she doesn't have the technical difficulties I do. I hate technology. On that note, I will finish up there. We'll hang around a little bit for questions, but we'll stop the recording and I'll take questions if I have to. My computer is on the way to having a meltdown. I'm not sure why. It's such a bad time. Just stop people's mics. You silly girl. Oh. All right. Let's see if I can turn people's mics on. Ooh. Not sure why it's been absolute pest day. Just such a bad time with this. I've got like that wheel color just going around. Ooh. I can see the chat. Actually, if you can write in the chat, you can ask a question. I apologize. I think, it's just been absolute computers today. I might have to wave my white flag at my peers, get emails if you have any questions, because I've still got this tiny little rainbow death circle going round and round. Yeah, I think that computer telling me it's had enough, telling me it's over. Done. Come on. I'm just going to yell it and be really cranky about it. Yeah, okay. That's all right. It's fine. I got through, hopefully, the presentation. Hopefully, everyone can see. I can't type, so if you have a question, you see it because the meeting time's over. I can't just like shut down and rejoin. So if you can still hear me, if it is still coming through, please send me questions. I'm happy to answer them and send you more. I can't take you on the beautiful sensory tour about. But if you have a look on the website, you can see them, www.cc.com.au. I'm sorry that has completely failed at the end, but yeah, I'm just happy to answer questions. I just won't be able to completely. All right, thanks so much. I'm going to sign off and just continue to torture myself with this. No, it's still, it's gone. It's gone. Now I can't even turn it off if the window. The worst thing is this, and then it was devastated.